have a lot of questions here, so I apologize in advance because there's no chance. There's less chance of getting through these questions than there is of powering the world with 100% renewable.
Let them ask the question. Why are you reading them?
I'm just doing what I'm told, man.
Let it be a democracy. Everybody speak.
Okay, so we're going to start with questions. I had some questions of my own, but we have so many here. Forgive my questions. So I'm going to just start from the top of the list here. This is coming from Zoe Caron. Zoe Caron, sorry. My apologies.
She's from World Wildlife.
Okay. I'm from Corporate Knights. Does everybody know me? How does Canada transform its export economy of bitumen to be either extremely low emission or shift completely to renewables, powered electricity as an export? Or are either of those even economically viable? So basically, is there a way to move to extremely low emission bitumen-based economy, which doesn't sound like a possibility? Or how do we shift completely to renewables in Canada?
You know, this problem is not unique to Canada, but there's very few other OECD nations, including the US, that has this problem like we've got it. And what I'm referring to is the fact that we're a producer and an exporter of petroleum on a pretty big scale relative to our economy and relative to our domestic emissions footprint. So at least 25% of all of our greenhouse gas emissions in this country come from the fossil fuel industry itself. And there are some very aggressive programs, technological research programs underway to try and reduce the intensity, the emissions intensity of the oil sands production itself. And the most promising of these are electric technologies. But you're still going to end up with a petroleum-based outcome, even if you can reduce the emission intensity of the petroleum production sector itself. And I can also tell you that in the context of trying to do a quantitative scenario analysis of low-carbon futures for Canada, which is the exercise we're in the middle of with the Trottier project, we can't see a way to sustainably hit 100 megaton target, which is about 80% below our 1990 greenhouse gas emissions, with a petroleum exporting sector of any magnitude at all. We think we could get most of the way there without completely eliminating fossil fuels, but they would be playing a much smaller role by 2050 in the scenarios we are developing than the one they play today. So I guess I'm skirting around it a bit, but the simple answer is no.
Okay, Mark has decided to pass on that question. Okay, this one is directed at Mark. It said, you made a compelling case that it's technically possible to make the transition to wind, water, and sun renewable energy. There's enough space, enough power from renewable sources. We can manage the intermittency. The needed technologies already exist. The question is, other studies, such as one from the World Wildlife Fund in 2009, suggest that the real bottlenecks may be more mundane, such as constraints on logistics, skilled labor issues, specialized plant machinery for manufacturing, installation, capital finance, all that boring stuff, and just the ability of industries to grow at 720% for decades. So are these serious challenges beyond the ones that you talked about?
Well, I think they're serious if we don't take the problem seriously. If we just go on the normal way that industry growth goes, yeah, those are serious problems because we need to really ramp up. So you have to have dedication from not only states and localities, but hopefully a national government to really be committed. I mean, usually in wartime, that's what happens. Things get ramped up. I mean, to convert you go back to World War II again. To convert, produce 330,000 airplanes from nothing in 5 years, really in the last 4 years. And it was just it's incredible ramp up. I mean, they converted all the automobile factories to airplane manufacturing factories. So I think it can be done if you really want to do it. But just doing normal operations, there's no incentive to do it. So you really need a large-scale ramp up. All those mundane things are not technical barriers. They're more like, I say, political or social barriers.
This question asks, what should we know about the environmental impact of producing wind turbines and solar panels? And I was thinking that when you were giving your presentation, did a lot of the numbers that you used include life cycle analysis of these renewable energy sources?
Yeah, the original rankings that I showed on one of the early slides where the rankings came out, part of that was based on the life cycle emissions from wind and solar. So wind, it pays back itself, it all depends on the wind speed, of course, but it pays back itself between 3 to 6 months of time, and with a 30-year lifetime, this makes it 99% in order to carbon free. Solar PV is more time. It can be up to 2 years out of 30 years. Concentrated solar is much more like 7 months or 9 months because it's mostly the materials are mirrors in there. Whereas the solar PV is more silicon based, it's more energy intensive. But that was all accounted for. So they're all technologies that are basically you could more than 95% effectively carbon free, and eventually over time, as you start replacing the energy infrastructure with them, they eventually even that life cycle emissions go down to zero because they're all the energy in the life cycle is being produced by wind, water, and sun.
Okay. Okay, this one is, what wind generation coincidence coefficient can Ontario deal with? It stands at about 0.5 now. How much wind can Ontario handle? Ralph, maybe this is one for you to take on because I don't really know it. Question. What's a wind generation coincidence coefficient?
I don't think I would venture to do the technical definition, but what I think the question is getting at, and the questioner, if they don't mind identifying themselves, could maybe clarify, but I think what you're asking is, what contribution could wind energy make to the Ontario grid before it runs up against these problems around dispatchability?
And just because we have a continental climate and it's, the wind is blowing in.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I mean, the fundamental problem with both wind and solar from the utility planning point of view is that you can't control when they're available the same way you can with a natural gas plant or even a conventional hydro dam or a geothermal plant where you can ramp the output up and down at will. Wind and solar is when the wind tends to be around when the wind is blowing. And the solar output goes way down at night. So so this is a problem because if you've got more of it than you need when the demand is low, that's one type of problem. And if it's not there when your demand is peaking, that's another type of problem. In the early days of looking at this, and I'm really right into Mark's area of expertise, so you can fix all the damage I'm doing here. But in the early days of thinking about this, we didn't have the models to do the kind of sophisticated simulation that Mark was describing in his presentation, which the National Renewable Energy Lab has been engaging in, which the Rocky Mountain Institute has been also showing leadership in, where we put together in a dynamic model the wind power that's available to us, taking into account the probability of it being available or not available hour by hour. we take into account that aspect of the electricity demand, which can be reduced at will without really affecting the end use. Like most forms of heat, water heating comes to mind immediately, for example. You're not going to notice if your water heater's off for an hour. You really aren't. I've got mine off for 12 hours a day now, and I don't notice it. You mix in the ability to use our hydroelectric storage reservoirs to smooth out this erratic availability of the wind and solar. You mix in some of the new storage technologies. You mix in the ability to increase the interconnectivity between grids so that we can be getting electricity from other parts of Canada when they're asleep, but maybe their wind is blowing, or maybe they've got the reservoirs. And so all of these things, in the early days, when they tried to figure out, well, how much non-dispatchable renewables, that's the technical term, and basically it's wind and solar, how much of this could you get onto the grid before it becomes a management nightmare for the grid managers? And the number used to be like 20%. What's happened just in the last few years, and some of the leadership for this has come from Mark and his colleagues, is that we've replaced those crude conservative assumptions with much more sophisticated, dynamic, real-time modeling of the future grid. And the number has gone all the way up to 80 or 90% renewables being possible, of which over half is non-dispatchable. So there's been breakthroughs in this area just within the last few years, and the current leading technical thinking on this subject is, for all practical purposes, there is no technical barrier to the percentage of electricity that you can get onto the grid from renewable sources.
Can we quote you on that?
Beg your pardon?
Can we quote you on that?
Sure. I can give you more authoritative quotes as well than myself, including perhaps Mark.
I wonder what Hydro One says about that. Actually, I know what Hydro One.
Well, I mean, for each, I agree with everything that was just stated, but I mean, for each location, you really want to optimize your resources. So it's really a separate optimization problem for each region. And so you look at what resources you have available, and you can perform an optimization to say what's the least cost way of doing it. So it's really not a question of can you do it, it's a question of how do you do it. And so it's really a question of what do we need to do to make it work. Because as I mentioned, it's not only just matching putting the wind together, solar, geothermal, hydro. If that doesn't work, you try that first. Well, you can do it. You can calculate it to see if that works. You can, from a modeling point of view, because you have enough data, you can actually do this from a modeling point of view. But if that doesn't work, you start doing all the other things that I listed, and there are actually several more beyond that, including, for example, when you add vehicles, when you have electric vehicles that are being charged, they're going to usually be charged at night. So usually your peak electricity demand is during the day now, but now when you have nighttime charging, because people want to use the lowest rates, you can now shift some of your time of peak demand to nighttime. You can oversize your wind and solar, and then the utility, people usually don't care what time they get their electricity at night, so they have a deal with the utility that the utility will pay them give them a better rate if they agree to have their car plugged in between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. And so suddenly there's a lot more flexibility on the grid. There's demand response where they can shift the time of peak demand during the day to nighttime or later in the day or earlier. And then there's all these other types of storage, like district heating, there's concentrated solar power, there's using, and the last thing, maybe batteries would be the last thing in some cases where because it's the most expensive. But there's a wind farm that went up in West Virginia last year. There was like, I don't know, there was 70 megawatts of wind, but plus 30 megawatts of batteries. And so they did it. I mean, I don't know how much it cost, but they do these things, but that would be the last thing I would do because it's probably the most expensive.
Kind of a follow-on to that question, though, is getting to that point, right? Obviously, there's a transition that takes place, and we're talking about technologies that are going to come in at different paces and at different levels of their development cycle. And a lot of this relies on information technology and software to make this thing operate. So, is there going, like, you kind of dismiss natural gas as a bridge. but, and this relates to one of the questions from the audience, do we not rely on something, if not natural gas, then something, to be able to manage that transition over the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years?
Well, every natural gas plant that goes up today is going to be there at least 35 years. So you're committing to those carbon emissions.
Okay, so you're not dismissing that we're gonna have to use it for that transition? Like,
Well, no, I don't think you need, I'm just saying we don't want to add, first of all, I don't want to add any new natural
Yeah.
gas. Existing natural gas, we're going to have to, I think it's good to phase it out as rapidly as we can, because it's contributing to these problems. And I don't think it's needed. It's certainly, there's an advantage, I mean, the only advantage I can see of it right now is that it is a nice load balancer like hydro.
Mhm.
I mean, but it does the exact same thing as hydro, so if you have enough hydro, you don't need natural gas either. I mean, like in California, there's really no need for it. But I don't see any reason why, if you really want to solve the problems, you have to get rid of everything that's bad immediately. So, and if you want to use it as a trend, in reality, there's going to be a lot of it that's going to be around for a while. So I say that knowing that there will be a lot around, but it doesn't mean you should try to get rid of it.
Ralph, you're itching to get in on that one.
Well, I wanted to fill in a little bit on the first part of the question, not so much on the natural gas bridge, but on the acceleration of that adoption that's implied by this scenario. And first let me say, and I say this lovingly and in no pejorative sense, but the scenario, the all-electric way of achieving the low-carbon future is not what you will find in the mainstream thinking on low-carbon futures. Mark is out there on this. Now, it's a good thing he's out there, and I'll tell you why. If you look at all of the leadership on thinking about low-carbon scenarios, by the way, has not come from the United States or Canada in the last 20 years. So, where there are a few exceptions. Mark is one of them, but you could count them on one hand, believe it or not, after all of these years of being warned by the climate scientists, in all of North America, including Canada, the number of people like Mark who are actually thinking about what the big picture transition to a very low carbon future might look like. So you have to go to Europe and to a certain extent to Japan to see what people are thinking who have been at this for 25, 30 years. And they all agree that we will use much, much more electricity in our end-use pie than we are now. Right now in Ontario, only about 20% of our energy end use is being provided by electricity. So to go to the type of all-electric future that Mark is sketching out would require that the other 80% of the end-use pie get converted to electricity. It makes the job of building the windmills actually look trivial, because it means that you have to take all of our medium, low, and high temperature heat over to electricity or hydrogen. That you have to convert all of our primary processing industries, which are important industries in this province, assuming that they're going to continue to be there, industrial chemicals, smelting, mining, refining, pulp and paper. They all have to find ways of doing what they do with electricity rather than fossil fuels. And you have to convert not only personal transportation, but freight transportation to all electric modes. Not too many people think this is likely. I remember all the things I told you about earlier that not too many people thought were possible, that came to pass. But right now, most of the people thinking about low carbon futures see a wall that we hit somewhere around 60% of the end use energy pie, where they see increasing electrification beyond that point being very difficult, or at least difficult to perceive at this point. And I'm talking about, the leaders in this field from the UK, Germany, Scandinavia, France, Japan, Australia. But this presents you with a dilemma when you hit that wall, because where will you get the rest of your energy if not from electricity and not from fossil fuels? You only have one other choice, and it's the biomass-based fuel vectors, which Mark has quite correctly pointed out come with a whole host of environmental problems of their own. And yet, with almost without exception, most of the low carbon scenarios that you will find out there, people who are thinking rigorously and quantitatively about how this transition might look, see the electrification of the end-use pie on a 40 or 50-year time frame being not going beyond about 60%. So, how did I get to that? I guess I'm just saying that this transition is, when you talk about the rate and the magnitude of the transformation we're talking about, it's not just building the windmills and the solar systems. It's all of the changes all the way down the line that have to occur in order to move the whole thing over to 100% dependence on electricity and electrolysis-based hydrogen. So it's a pretty big deal. It's an exciting concept. It's a very empowering and motivating future if we could do it, because it does eliminate these nasty problems from going to a reliance on bioenergy and biomass and all of that. But it's a big transition, and we've already run out of time to really make a legitimate claim that we can do this quick enough now to stop dangerous climate change.
Okay, this next question is specific to solar, and it's directed at Mark's presentation. It's asking how you came to the payback period for solar PV. I think they use the example, 5 kilowatt system would cost around 38 to 40K. How can the payback on a household be 2 years if each month it saves $100 to $150 in electricity bill? That was something that I was thinking about. Is your analysis is based on California, largely? Because obviously in Ontario would be a different scenario.
So I'm trying to think of which number is being referred to. It's the, in terms of the payback time, I mean, if you look at it depends if it's utility scale versus residential scale. I mean, utility scale solar, as I mentioned, is about $230 a watt to $290 a watt. And so in this residential rooftop solar could be up to $6 a watt, and which is still lower than it used to be 2 or 3 years ago. And then there's numbers in between. But it also depends on whether you're getting incentives, depending on the types of incentives you're getting. I mean, but I'll just give you my own example. I've had solar on my roof for 6 years, and I haven't paid an electricity bill in 6 years. And I've converted everything in my house to electricity, including got rid of the natural gas water heater, natural gas air heaters, got rid of the gasoline car to get an electric car. And the electric car takes 10% of the household electricity. And still, at the end of the year last year, the utility owed me $400, which they never paid. Because of a loophole in the
Turn their lights off.
How big's your array?
What's that?
How big is your array?
It's 15 kilowatts.
50 kilowatts.
15, 1.5. Yeah, but it powers, so it powers everything. All the electricity plus the heating, cooling, bottom.
Is that all rooftop based?
Yeah, it's all rooftop.
You have a big house. 15
It's long, it's just a
Okay.
ranch style.
Don't sell your surplus energy, use it to become gear.
Well, yeah, I was thinking, this is an incentive just to waste energy. Because the lights on. But I'm just thinking, so certainly there's an investment, but their panels are warranted for 25 years. If they pay themselves off based on at least the rates I calculated, those panels, which I bought earlier, which are more expensive than they are now, I mean, those paid themselves off, they said, from the calculation, about 13 years at that time, 13 to 14 years. But even that, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, 13, you get free electricity after that until you're 25 years, even longer if your panels last longer than that. And so it just seems like mindless not to do it, because you're not really sacrificing anything, except it's harder for the upfront cost. But now there are companies that will lease you they'll put panels on your roof, and they'll take all the upfront costs, and they just lease, so you just have to pay a certain amount each month for them. So you can generate solar without having to worry about the upfront cost. There are lots of financing deals available. And then plus they have all sorts of options. Besides, you have the feed-in tariff here, but there's things called virtual net metering and which allows big commercial buildings that have lots of tenants to assign credits for their solar device to each of the tenants individually, which really gives incentive for people who own big buildings to put a lot of solar on their roof. But it's just the whole world has changed in terms of solar financing and being able to put them on in an affordable way. I think for just residents, even without credits, you can still, it'll still pay back before the time that the panels are warranted through. And when I get paid on what's called a net metering, so they pay me based on what I would pay if I were using electricity at the same time. So at the peak time of day, the highest tier, which is like in the summer, is 52 cents a kilowatt hour about, that they pay me out. Where I use the electricity at night, mostly, where it's like, whatever it is, 5-10 cents a kilowatt hour. And so that's why it's such an advantage. It's not so much the cost of the panels, it's what they pay you for it. If they're required to pay you at the actual cost of electricity, when you're generating at peak time, you're getting paid a higher rate. It's the value of the commodity that's really important. It's the value of the peak time of day that it's generating electricity.
Okay, unfortunately, I've been told that we're well over our time. We have so many questions and not enough time, so I'm going to have to bring... No, which one was the little voice?
The last one he brought it up.
Oh, sorry. It's all mixed in, I'm sorry. But I think we are out of time. But you'll be around after this for individual questions, yeah?
We're going to Poor Girl?
Oh, yeah, so you can go to Poor Girl. I don't know if the little boy who gave me the question.
He was only delivering.
Oh, he was only delivering. Okay, so I don't feel as bad. Okay, thanks very much, Mark and Ralph, for the stimulating conversation.